It was a super sunny Saturday morning. The kind of day where the sky is bright blue, the birds are chirping, and you just want to run outside and have fun. That's exactly what 12-year-old Jake Miller was thinking about. Jake was a kid who lived in a quiet little neighborhood. His street had big houses with huge windows, green lawns that looked like soft carpets, and trees that waved in the breeze. It was a nice place, but it had some nosy neighbors too, people who liked to peek out their curtains and watch what everyone else was doing. Jake was the kind of boy who didn't make a big fuss. He wasn't loud or wild like some kids. He didn't run around yelling or showing off. Nope, Jake was chill. He liked riding his bike up and down the street, feeling the wind in his hair. Or sometimes he'd sit in his room, playing video games on his little TV. He had this cool game where you drive fast cars and zoom past everyone. Jake was good at it too, he could win almost every race. But outside his room, nobody really noticed him much. To them, he was just that kid with the bike. A regular boy. Nothing special. At least, that's what they thought. But here's the thing, Jake wasn't just a regular kid. Oh no. He had something up his sleeve that nobody knew about. Something that was going to shake up the whole neighborhood and make everyone's jaw drop to the ground. What was it? Well, I'll give you a hint, it was small, it was sneaky, and it was about to change everything. Can you guess what it might be? Don't worry if you can't, I'll tell you soon. But first, let's get to know Jake a little better. Jake lived in a yellow house with a red door. It wasn't the biggest house on the street, but it was cozy. He shared it with his mom, who was always baking cookies or singing silly songs, and his little sister, Mia, who was 6 and loved drawing pictures of cats. Jake's dad didn't live with them anymore, but that was okay. Jake and his mom and Mia were a team. They had fun together, like when they'd watch movies on Friday nights or build forts out of blankets in the living room. Jake liked his family a lot, even if Mia sometimes bugged him by stealing his snacks. Now, Jake wasn't the tallest kid in his class. He had messy brown hair that stuck up in the back, green eyes that sparkled when he laughed, and a big grin that showed up whenever he was happy. He wore sneakers that were a little worn out because he ran around so much, and his favorite shirt was a blue one with a rocket on it. Jake loved rockets and spaceships. Sometimes he'd lie on the grass in his backyard, staring up at the sky, dreaming about flying to the moon. He'd imagine zooming past stars and landing on planets where nobody had ever been before. Cool, right? But even though Jake dreamed big, most people didn't see that side of him. To the neighbors, he was just the kid who rode his bike too fast sometimes. They'd see him pedaling down the street, his helmet wobbling a little, and they'd shake their heads. "Slow down, kid," they'd yell from their porches. Jake would just wave and keep going. He didn't care if they thought he was a troublemaker. He liked his bike. It was red and shiny, with a bell that went ding-ding when he pressed it. That bike was his way to feel free, like he could go anywhere, anytime. So, on this sunny Saturday morning, Jake was outside with his bike. The air smelled like flowers and fresh-cut grass. He hopped on, his sneakers pushing the pedals, and started riding. The wheels hummed against the pavement, and he smiled as the breeze hit his face. It was a perfect day. Nothing could go wrong, right? Well, that's what Jake thought too. He had no idea that something sneaky was about to happen. Something that would make him mad, but also something that would give him a chance to be a hero. Let's talk about Jake's neighborhood for a second. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone. There was old Mr. Jenkins, who sat on his porch every day with his little dog, Sparky. There was Mrs. Lopez, who grew the best tomatoes in her garden and gave them to anyone who asked. And then there were the kids like Tommy, who was Jake's age and loved skateboarding, and Lily, who was always reading books under a tree. It was a happy place most of the time. But not everyone was nice. Nope. There were a couple of grown ups who thought they were the bosses of everything. And those guys? They were about to mess with Jake in a big way. Before I tell you about them, let's go back to Jake. See, Jake wasn't just a kid who liked bikes and games. He was smart, really smart. Not the kind of smart where you get straight A's in school, though he did okay in class. No, Jake was smart in a different way. He noticed things. Like how the birds always flew the same way every morning, or how the mailman's truck made a funny squeak when it turned the corner. Jake paid attention to little details that other people missed. And that made him special, even if nobody else saw it yet. Here's where the secret weapon comes in. Are you ready to hear about it? Okay, here goes. Jake had a tiny little camera. Not a big one like the ones you see in movies, but a small one called a Dashcam. It was about the size of a candy bar, and it stuck right onto his bike helmet with a little clip. Jake got it for his birthday a few months ago. His mom had given it to him in a shiny box, and when he opened it, his eyes got huge. "Whoa," he said. "This is awesome." His mom laughed and said, "I thought you'd like it. You can record your bike rides and show us where you go." Jake loved that idea. He started wearing the Dashcam every time he rode his bike. He'd turn it on, and it would record everything he saw: the houses, the trees, the dogs barking at him as he zoomed by. Sometimes he'd watch the videos on his computer later, laughing at how funny he looked when he went over a bump and wobbled. It was his little toy, his cool gadget. He didn't think it would ever be more than that. But oh boy, was he wrong. That Dashcam? It was about to become the most important thing Jake owned. Because on this sunny Saturday, something big was brewing. Something sneaky and mean was coming Jake's way, and that little camera was going to catch it all. Can you imagine having a secret like that? Something nobody knows about, but it's so powerful it could surprise everyone? That's what Jake had, and he didn't even know how big it would get. Let's set the scene a little more. Jake was riding his bike down the street, the sun shining bright overhead. He passed Mr. Jenkins, who waved and said, "Nice day, huh?" Jake nodded and rang his bell. Ding ding. He kept going, turning the corner where Mrs. Lopez was watering her flowers. "Hi, Jake," she called. "Say hi to your mom for me." Jake smiled and yelled back, "I will." Everything felt normal. Happy. Peaceful. The kind of day where you think nothing bad could happen. But then Jake saw them two guys standing at the end of the street. They weren't regular neighbors. They were the ones everyone whispered about. Ted and Carl. The HOA cops, they called themselves. They weren't real cops, though. They didn't have shiny badges or cool cars with sirens. Nope, they were just two grumpy grown UPS who liked telling people what to do. Ted was tall and loud, with a big belly and a red face. Carl was shorter, with squinty eyes and a voice that sounded like a frog croaking. They wore these goofy orange vests that said HOA Patrol in big letters, like they thought it made them important. Ted and Carl loved bossing people around. They'd yell at Tommy for skateboarding on the sidewalk. They'd tell Mrs. Lopez her flowers were too bright, which was silly, because who doesn't like flowers? And they'd even shout at Mr. Jenkins' dog, Sparky, for barking too much. Nobody liked them, but nobody stopped them either. They acted like they ruled the neighborhood, and most people just sighed and let them be. Jake had seen Ted and Carl before. They'd glared at him when he rode his bike past them, muttering stuff like, "Kids these days." Jake didn't care. He'd just pedal faster and leave them behind. But today was different. As Jake rode closer, he saw Ted point at him and say something to Carl. Carl nodded, and they both smirked. Jake didn't know what they were up to, but he felt a little tingle in his stomach, like something wasn't right. He slowed down his bike, the wheels making a soft whir sound. Ted stepped forward and crossed his arms. "Hey, kid," he shouted. "You're riding too fast again." Carl chimed in, "Yeah, this isn't a playground." Jake stopped his bike and looked at them. "I'm not going fast," he said calmly. "I'm just riding." Ted laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. It was mean and loud. "Oh, you think you're so smart, huh?" he said. "Maybe we need to teach you a lesson." Jake didn't say anything back. He just stared at them for a second, then pedaled away. He could hear them laughing behind him, their voices echoing down the street. He didn't like it, but he didn't let it ruin his day. Not yet. He rode home, parked his bike on the porch, and went inside to grab a juice box. The sun was still shining, the birds were still singing, and Jake thought that was the end of it. Ted and Carl were just being their usual grumpy selves. No big deal, right? Wrong. So very wrong. Because that night, something was going to happen. Something sneaky. Something mean. And Jake's little Dashcam, the one he'd left charging on the porch, was going to see it all. Those two fake HOA cops thought they could mess with Jake and get away with it. They thought he was just a kid who couldn't fight back. But they didn't know about his secret weapon. They didn't know that Jake was smarter than they thought. And they definitely didn't know that this sunny Saturday was the start of something huge. Jake's neighborhood was usually a quiet, happy place. Big houses with pretty lawns, kids playing outside, and friendly folks waving hello. But there were two guys who made things less fun. Their names were Ted and Carl, and they called themselves the HOA cops. Now, they weren't real cops, no way. They didn't have shiny badges or cool hats or those flashing lights on a police car. Nope, they were just a couple of grumpy grown UPS who liked acting tough. They were bullies, plain and simple, and they loved bossing everyone around. Ted was the loud one. He was tall, with a big round belly that jiggled when he walked. His face was always red, like he'd been yelling too much, and his voice was so booming it could wake up the whole street. Carl was different, shorter, with skinny arms and squinty little eyes that made him look sneaky. He didn't talk as loud as Ted, but he had this mean laugh that sounded like a frog croaking. Together, they were a team of troublemakers. These two wore silly orange vests they'd made themselves. The vests had big black letters that said HOA Patrol, which stood for Homeowners Association Patrol. They thought it made them look important, like they were in charge of the neighborhood. But really, it just made them look goofy. They'd walk up and down the streets, their vests flapping, pointing at stuff and telling people what to do. "Hey, your grass is too long." Ted would yell at someone's house. "Cut it, or else." Carl would add, "Yeah, we're watching you." Most folks just rolled their eyes and went back inside. Nobody liked them, but nobody told them to stop either. It was like Ted and Carl thought they owned the whole place. They picked on everyone. If a kid rode a bike, they'd shout, "Slow down, you little speed demon." If someone parked their car a tiny bit crooked, they'd bang on the window and say, "Fix it." Even poor old Mr. Jenkins got in trouble. He had a tiny dog named Sparky who barked at squirrels, and Ted would stomp over and growl, "Shut that mutt up." Mr. Jenkins would just shake his head and take Sparky inside. Ted and Carl acted like kings, but they weren't. They were just mean guys who liked making rules that didn't even exist. Jake knew about Ted and Carl. He'd seen them plenty of times. Sometimes when he rode his red bike down the street, they'd glare at him from the sidewalk. "Watch it, kid," Ted would holler. Carl would smirk and mutter something Jake couldn't hear. Jake didn't care much. He'd just pedal faster, his bike bell going ding ding, and leave them behind. They were annoying, sure, but Jake figured they were all talk. Big mouths, no action. That's what he thought, anyway. Until one day, everything changed. It was a warm afternoon, and Jake was riding home from the park. The sun was still high, making the pavement hot under his tires. He'd been at the park for hours, racing around the paths and jumping off little ramps he'd made with his friend Tommy. His legs were tired, but he felt good. The wind felt nice on his face, and his bike hummed as he turned onto his street. He was almost home, just a few more houses to go when he saw them. Ted and Carl. They were standing right in the middle of the road, blocking his way. Their orange vests glowed like traffic cones, and they had their arms crossed like they were waiting for him. Jake slowed down, his sneakers brushing the ground. He didn't want to stop, but he had to. They were right in front of him, and there was no way around. "Hey, kid," Ted barked. His voice was loud and mean, like a dog growling at a stranger. "You're going too fast again. This ain't a racetrack." Jake blinked up at him. Ted's red face looked even redder in the sunlight, and his belly stuck out over his pants. Carl stepped closer, his squinty eyes narrowing. "Yeah," he sneered, "you think you're some big shot on that bike. Maybe we should teach you a lesson." Jake didn't flinch. He just sat there on his bike, one foot on the pedal, one on the ground. He looked at Ted, then at Carl. Their words stung a little, like a bee buzzing too close, but he didn't let it show. "I'm not going fast," he said quietly. "I'm just riding home." Ted laughed a big, fake laugh that echoed off the houses. "Oh, listen to this guy," he said to Carl. "Thinks he can talk back to us." Carl nodded, his frog voice croaking out, "Yeah, kid, you better watch yourself." Jake didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He could feel their angry stares digging into him, like they were trying to scare him. Their eyes were hard and cold, and their smirks said they thought they were so tough. But Jake wasn't scared. Not really. He just shrugged, like it was no big deal, and pushed off with his foot. His bike rolled forward, slow at first, then faster. He pedaled past them, heading for his house. He could hear Ted yell something behind him, "You'll see, kid." And Carl's mean laugh followed. Jake didn't look back. He kept going, the wind in his ears drowning them out. When he got home, he parked his bike on the porch and went inside. His mom was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. "Hey, Jake," she called. "How was the park?" Jake grabbed a glass of water and said, "It was fun. Tommy fell off his skateboard, though." His mom laughed. "That boy's always tumbling." Jake smiled a little and sat down at the table. He didn't tell her about Ted and Carl. Not yet. He didn't want her to worry. But as he drank his water, he kept thinking about them. Their loud voices. Their mean words. That teach you a lesson part stuck in his head. What did they mean? Were they just talking big, like always? Or was something else coming? Jake didn't know it then, but something was coming. Something sneaky and bad. That night, after the sun went down and the stars popped out, Jake was in his room playing his car racing game. The house was quiet. His mom was watching TV downstairs, and his little sister, Mia, was already asleep, probably dreaming about her silly cat drawings. Jake's window was open a crack, letting in the cool night air. Everything felt calm. Peaceful. Until he heard it. A weird noise. It came from outside, sharp and quick, slash, slash, slash. Jake's head snapped up from his game. What was that? It sounded like something cutting, something ripping. He paused his game, the little car on the screen freezing mid-race, and tiptoed to his window. He pushed the curtain aside and peeked out into the dark. At first, he didn't see anything. The street lights made soft yellow pools on the road, but everything else was shadows. Then he looked down at his driveway, right where he'd left his bike. And there they were, Ted and Carl. They were crouched by his bike, their orange vests glowing faintly in the dim light. Jake's heart jumped. What were they doing? He squinted, trying to see better, and then he saw it. Carl had a little pocket knife in his hand. He was slicing Jake's bike tire, slash, slash, slash. The rubber split open, air hissing out like a mad snake. Ted was standing next to him, giggling like a sneaky rat. "Take that, kid," Ted whispered, his voice low but happy. Carl laughed too, that croaky frog sound, and slashed the last tire. Jake's mouth fell open. His bike tires flat as pancakes now. All four of them, ruined. He watched as Ted and Carl stood up, brushing their hands like they just finished a job. They looked at each other and grinned, proud of themselves. "He won't ride that thing anytime soon," Carl said. Ted nodded. "Yeah, that'll show him who's boss." Then they turned and strutted away, disappearing into the dark like they'd never been there. Jake stood at his window, his hands clenched into fists. He was mad, so mad his face felt hot. His bike. His favorite thing. Ted and Carl had snuck over in the night and wrecked it, just because they didn't like him. He wanted to run outside and yell at them. He wanted to tell his mom and call someone to catch them. But he didn't move. He just stood there, breathing hard, watching the empty street. And then he remembered something. Something important. His dashcam. That little camera he'd gotten for his birthday, it was still on the porch, plugged into its charger. Jake had left it there after his ride, letting it juice up overnight. It was pointed right at the driveway. Had it been on? Was it recording? Jake's heart raced even faster. If it was, if it caught what Ted and Carl did, then he had them. He had proof. He didn't run out to check right then. It was too dark, and he didn't want Ted and Carl to see him if they were still lurking around. But his mind was spinning. Those two bullies thought they were so clever. They thought they could sneak around, slash his tires, and get away with it. They thought Jake was just a kid who couldn't do anything about it. But they didn't know his secret. They didn't know about the dash cam. And they didn't know that Jake was already planning something big. Jake went back to his bed and sat down, staring at the paused game on his TV. He wasn't mad anymore. Well, he was, but now he was excited too. Ted and Carl had messed with the wrong kid. They'd crossed a line, and Jake wasn't going to let it slide. He didn't say a word to anyone that night. He didn't have to. He had a plan forming in his head, and it was going to be awesome. The next morning, he'd check that dash cam. If it caught what he thought it did, Ted and Carl were in for a surprise. A big one. They thought they were the bosses of the neighborhood, but Jake was about to show them they weren't. Not anymore. The tension was building, like a storm cloud getting ready to burst. And Jake? He was ready to make it rain. Jake sat on his bed, his game still paused on the TV screen. The little race car was stuck mid-turn, waiting for him to hit play. But Jake wasn't thinking about games anymore. His mind was racing faster than that car ever could. Ted and Carl, those two fake HOA cops, had just slashed his bike tires. His awesome red bike, the one he rode every day, was sitting out there in the dark with flat tires, all because those bullies wanted to teach him a lesson. Jake's hands were still tied in fists, and his heart was thumping loud in his chest. He couldn't believe it. They'd really done it. They'd snuck over like sneaky foxes and ruined his favorite thing. But then there was that other thought, the dash cam. That tiny camera on the porch. Jake's secret weapon. He'd left it charging out there, plugged into the little outlet by the front door. It was always pointed at the driveway when he charged it, just in case he wanted to record himself riding up to the house. Had it been on? Did it see Ted and Carl? Jake didn't know for sure yet, but the idea made his stomach flip with excitement. If it did catch them, he'd have them trapped like flies in a web. They wouldn't be able to wiggle out of this one. He lay back on his pillow, staring up at the ceiling. His room was dark except for the glow of the TV. The posters on his walls, rockets and planets, looked shadowy in the dim light. Outside, the night was quiet again. No more slashing sounds, no more giggles from Ted and Carl. They were gone now, probably back at their own houses, thinking they'd won. Thinking they'd scare Jake and taught him who's boss. Jake smiled a little to himself. "Oh, you guys are so wrong," he whispered into the dark. They didn't know what was coming. Not yet. Jake's mind went back to earlier that day when Ted and Carl had stopped him on the street. He could still see Ted's red face, all puffed up and mad, yelling about how Jake was riding too fast. He could hear Carl's croaky voice, saying they'd teach him a lesson. Jake hadn't thought much of it then. He'd figured they were just being their usual loud, annoying selves. But now he knew they weren't just talking. They meant it. They'd waited until dark, crept over like thieves, and slashed his tires. It wasn't just mean, it was sneaky. And that made Jake even madder. He thought about his bike. That red bike with the shiny bell ding ding, was more than just a thing to him. It was his freedom. His way to zoom around and feel the wind. He'd saved up his allowance for months to get new pedals for it last summer, and his mom had helped him paint the frame when it got scratched. It was his. And Ted and Carl had wrecked it, just because they didn't like him riding it. Jake's jaw tightened. They weren't getting away with this. No way. But he had to be smart. Jake knew he couldn't just run out and yell at them right now. It was late, and they were gone. Plus, he didn't want them to know he'd seen them, not yet. He wanted to surprise them. He wanted to catch them when they least expected it. And that dash cam? That might be the key. If it worked, if it recorded them, he'd have proof. Real proof. Not just his word against theirs. Grown ups always believed proof, right? Like in those detective shows his mom watched, where they find fingerprints or videos and catch the bad guys. Jake could be a detective too. Detective Jake, solving the case of the slashed tires. He rolled over on his bed, pulling his blanket up to his chin. He needed to sleep, but his brain wouldn't stop buzzing. He kept picturing Ted and Carl out there in the dark, giggling like silly rats. Ted's big belly shaking as he laughed. Carl's squinty eyes glinting as he swung that knife. Jake hated that they thought they were so smart. They thought nobody would know. They thought Jake was just a kid who'd cry and give up. But Jake wasn't crying. He wasn't giving up. He was planning. Downstairs, he heard the TV turn off. His mom's footsteps creaked on the stairs as she came up to bed. "Jake," she called softly through his door. "You asleep?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't want to talk yet. He just stayed still, pretending to snooze. His mom peeked in, saw him under the blanket, and whispered, "Good night, sweetie." Then she closed the door, and the house went quiet again. Jake opened his eyes. He stared at the little rocket model on his shelf. It was one he'd built with his mom last year, red and white, with tiny fins. He liked rockets because they were fast and strong. They didn't let anything stop them. And right now, Jake felt like a rocket. He was mad, sure, but he was ready to blast off and show Ted and Carl they'd picked the wrong kid to mess with. He started thinking about the neighborhood. Ted and Carl had been bossing people around for months. Jake remembered how they'd yelled at Tommy for skateboarding last week. "Get off that board, kid!" Ted had shouted, waving his arms like a crazy bird. Tommy had just laughed and skated away, but it still made Jake mad. And then there was Mrs. Lopez. She'd told Jake once that Carl came to her house and said her flowers were too messy. Too messy? Flowers? That was so dumb. Mrs. Lopez had just smiled and kept watering them, but Jake could tell it bugged her. Even Lily, the quiet girl who read books under the tree, had a story. One day, Carl had walked by and kicked her book out of her hands, saying, "Stop sitting there all day." Lily had picked it up, her face red, and didn't say a word. Ted and Carl picked on everyone, kids, grown-ups, even dogs like Sparky. And nobody did anything about it. They just let them keep acting like kings. But now they'd gone too far. Slashing Jake's tires wasn't just mean, it was wrong. And Jake wasn't going to let it slide. He thought about what might happen next. Would Ted and Carl come back? Would they brag about what they did? Jake bet they would. They loved showing off. He could picture them tomorrow, strutting down the street in those goofy vests, telling everyone, "That kid won't ride his bike anymore." They'd laugh and pat each other on the back, thinking they were so tough. The idea made Jake's stomach twist. He didn't want them to win. He didn't want them to think they'd scared him. But then he thought about the dash cam again, and that twist turned into a spark. If it worked, if it really caught them, he'd have something they couldn't fight. A video. Clear as day. Ted and Carl, right there on the screen, slashing his tires and giggling. Jake could take it to his mom. Or to the neighbors. Or even to the real HOA people, like Mrs. Carter, who was actually nice and didn't wear dumb vests. They'd have to listen. They'd have to do something. Ted and Carl wouldn't be laughing then. Jake's eyes started to feel heavy. The excitement was still there, but sleep was creeping in. He pulled his blanket tighter and let his mind wander. He imagined Ted's red face turning pale when he saw the video. He pictured Carl's squinty eyes going wide, his frog voice stammering, that's not us." Jake grinned in the dark. Oh, it was them. And he'd prove it. The clock on his nightstand ticked softly. It was late past midnight now. The neighborhood was silent outside, the street lights glowing through his window. Jake's bike was still out there, its flat tires sad and droopy. But Jake wasn't sad. He was ready. Tomorrow, he'd check that dash cam. Tomorrow, he'd start his plan. Ted and Carl thought they'd won this round, but they didn't know Jake. They didn't know he was smart. They didn't know he was tough. And they definitely didn't know about the secret weapon waiting on the porch. The next morning came fast. The sun peeked through Jake's window, making little yellow lines on his floor. He woke up with a jump, like his brain was already buzzing. He didn't cry about his bike. He didn't run to his mom and whine. Nope. Jake had a better idea. He hopped out of bed, his bare feet slapping the cold floor, and ran to the porch. His dash cam was still there, plugged in, sitting quiet like it was waiting for him. That little camera, his secret weapon, was about to tell him everything. Jake grabbed it quick, pulling the cord out with a yank. His heart was thumping loud, like a drum in his chest. He raced back to his room, his messy brown hair bouncing, and shut the door. His laptop was on his desk, a little old thing with stickers of stars on it. He flipped it open, plugged the dash cam in with a tiny cable, and clicked a button. Come on, he mumbled, tapping his foot. The screen blinked, and then there it was. The video. Jake's eyes got big. He leaned close, his nose almost touching the screen. The footage was clear as day, even though it was night when it happened. The dash cam had a little light that made everything show up. And right there, in black and white and a little green from the night vision, were Ted and Carl. Sneaky as rats, they crept up to his driveway. Ted's big belly wobbled as he tiptoed, and Carl's squinty eyes glinted like a cat's. Jake watched, holding his breath, as Carl pulled out that pocket knife. Slash, slash, slash. The knife cut through his bike tires, one by one. Air hissed out, and the tires went flat as pancakes. Ted giggled, his loud voice trying to stay quiet. "Take that, kid," he whispered. Carl laughed too, that croaky frog sound, and said, "Yeah, he's done now." Jake's mouth dropped open, then turned into a grin. He couldn't believe it. Well, he could, because he'd seen them last night, but seeing it again on the screen? It was like finding treasure. "Oh, you guys are in for it now," he whispered to himself. He hit replay and watched it again, just to be sure. Yep, there they were, Ted and Carl, slashing his tires and laughing like they'd won a big prize. Jake's grin got bigger. He had them. He really had them. He didn't tell anyone right away. Not his mom, not his little sister Mia, not even his best friend Tommy. Jake wanted to keep it secret for now. He had a plan, a big one, and he needed to wait for the right time. So, for the next few days, he acted like nothing happened. He went outside, he ate breakfast, he played his video games. But inside, he was buzzing with excitement, like a bee in a jar. He knew something Ted and Carl didn't, and it made him feel strong. Ted and Carl didn't stop their nonsense. Oh no. They kept strutting around the neighborhood, their goofy orange vests flapping in the wind. They walked up and down the streets, acting tough, like they were the kings of everything. Jake saw them from his porch one morning, leaning on the railing with a juice box in his hand. Ted's loud voice boomed across the lawns. "That kid won't ride his bike around here anymore," he said to Mr. Jenkins, who was watering his flowers. Carl nodded, his squinty eyes smirking. "Yeah, we fixed him good." Mr. Jenkins just shrugged and kept watering, but Jake heard every word. He sipped his juice and smirked too. "Fixed me, huh," he thought. "We'll see about that." Jake's bike was still out of action, but he wasn't sitting around feeling sad. Nope. He was fixing it. He took it to the garage that afternoon, his sneakers crunching on the gravel. His mom had an old toolbox in there, red and rusty, with hammers and screws and stuff. Jake found a tire patch kit inside, the kind with sticky patches and glue. He sat on the floor, his bike tipped over next to him, and got to work. He patched one tire, then another, blowing air in with a little pump. His hands got dirty, and sweat dripped down his face, but he didn't care. He hummed a little song while he worked, feeling busy and happy. Ted and Carl thought they'd stopped him, but they were wrong. Jake was coming back stronger. While he fixed his tires, he kept an eye on the street. Every time Ted and Carl walked by, he'd peek out the garage door. They didn't know he was watching. They'd pass his house, their vests bright orange against the green grass, and Jake would wave. Just a little wave, like he was being friendly. "Hey, guys," he'd call, his voice all sweet and normal. Ted would laugh, that big fake laugh, and say, "Hey, kid. Staying out of trouble." Carl would whisper something to Ted, and they'd both giggle like they had a secret joke. They thought they'd scared him. They thought he was afraid of them now. But Jake? He wasn't scared. Not one bit. He was counting down the minutes, waiting for the perfect moment. See, Jake didn't just want to tell on them. Telling his mom or the neighbors might work, sure, but it wouldn't be big enough. He wanted everyone to see what Ted and Carl did. He wanted them to get caught in front of the whole neighborhood, so they couldn't wiggle out of it. And that dashcam video? It was his ticket. His golden key. Every time he thought about it, his heart raced with excitement. He could picture their faces, Ted's red cheeks going pale, Carl's squinty eyes popping wide. Oh, it was going to be good. The next day, Jake went outside to test his bike. The tires were patched, not perfect, but good enough to roll. He pedaled slow down the driveway, the wheels wobbling a little. It felt good to ride again, even if it wasn't as fast as before. The sun was warm, and the birds were chirping like nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. Ted and Carl were still out there, acting like bullies. Jake saw them down the street, yelling at Tommy again. Get that skateboard off the road. Ted shouted. Tommy zoomed away, laughing, but Jake frowned. Those guys never stopped. Jake rode his bike to the park, keeping his eyes open. He wanted to see what else Ted and Carl were up to. At the park, he sat on a bench with his bike next to him. He watched kids play on the swings and dogs chase balls. Everything was happy until Ted and Carl showed up. They marched in, their vests flapping, and started bossing people around. Hey, pick up that trash. Ted yelled at a little kid with an ice cream wrapper. The kid ran off, scared. Carl kicked a soccer ball away from some boys, saying, "Too much noise." The boys grumbled but didn't fight back. Jake watched it all, his hands tight on his bike handles. He didn't like it. Not one bit. He rode home slow, thinking hard. Ted and Carl weren't just mean to him, they were mean to everyone. And nobody stopped them. Why? Jake didn't get it. Grown UPS were supposed to be fair, right? But Ted and Carl acted like they could do anything. Slashing his tires was the worst thing yet, but it wasn't the only thing. Jake started remembering little stuff like how Carl had told Mrs. Lopez her flowers were ugly, or how Ted had yelled at Lily for reading too long. It was all adding up, like pieces in a puzzle. And Jake was starting to see the picture. Back at home, he parked his bike and went inside. His mom was making cookies, chocolate chip, his favorite. Want one? She asked, holding out a gooey cookie. Jake took it and nodded. Thanks, Mom. He sat at the table, munching, but his mind was still on Ted and Carl. He didn't tell his mom about the tires yet. He wanted to wait. He wanted to fix this his way. That night, Jake watched the video again. He couldn't help it. He plugged the dashcam back into his laptop and hit play. Slash, slash, slash. There they were, Ted and Carl, laughing in the dark. Jake leaned close, noticing little things. Like how Ted's vest had a rip on the side. Or how Carl's knife had a red handle. Small stuff, but it made the video even better. It was real. It was them. And Jake had it all. For the next few days, he kept quiet. He went to school, he did his homework, he played with Mia. But every time he saw Ted and Carl, he waved and smiled. They'd pass his house, talking loud about how they'd taught that kid a lesson. Jake heard them once from his window, Ted saying, "He's too scared to ride now." Carl laughing, "Yeah, we're the bosses." Jake just smirked and closed the curtain. They had no idea. Every wave, every smile, it was part of his plan. He wanted them to think he was fine. He wanted them to feel safe, like they'd won. But inside, Jake was counting down. Counting the minutes until he could show everyone that video. His heart raced every time he thought about it. He'd fixed his tires, sure, but that wasn't the end. It was just the start. Ted and Carl were walking into a trap, and they didn't even know it. One afternoon, Jake sat on his porch with Tommy. They were eating popsicles, cherry for Jake, grape for Tommy. "Those HOA guys are jerks," Tommy said, licking his popsicle. "They yelled at me again yesterday." Jake nodded. "Yeah, they're mean." Tommy didn't know about the tires, but Jake almost told him. Almost. He stopped himself, though. He wanted it to be a surprise, a big one for everyone. The days went by, slow and steady. Jake watched. He waited. Ted and Carl kept strutting, kept bragging. And every time they passed, Jake waved. "Hey, guys," he'd say, all cheerful. They'd laugh and whisper, thinking they'd beat him. But Jake knew something they didn't. He had the video. He had the proof. And he was waiting for the perfect moment to use it. The excitement made his tummy tingle, like when you're about to go down a big slide. Ted and Carl thought they were tough, but Jake was tougher. And soon, everyone would see it. The big day finally came. It was time for the neighborhood meeting. Every month, all the folks in Jake's neighborhood got together at the community center. It was a little building with a big room, some chairs, and a stage up front. They'd sit around and talk about boring stuff like what food to bring to the summer picnic or whose turn it was to paint the mailbox by the park. Most people didn't love going. It was kind of dull, and sometimes it took forever. But Ted and Carl? Oh, they loved those meetings. They'd strut in like they were the coolest guys ever, wearing their goofy orange vests, and stand right up front. They acted like kings, telling everyone how to live, what rules to follow, and who was doing stuff wrong. Nobody really liked it, but they let them talk anyway. This time was different, though. This time, Jake showed up. He wasn't usually a meeting kind of kid. He'd rather be riding his bike or playing video games. But today, he had a reason to be there. A big reason. He walked into the community center with his laptop tucked under his arm. It was his little old laptop with star stickers on it, the one he'd used to watch that Dashcam video 100 times. He held it tight, like it was a treasure chest full of gold. And on his face? A big, sneaky smile. Jake was ready. Oh, he was so ready. The room was full of people. There was old Mr. Jenkins, sitting near the door with his little dog Sparky on his lap. Mrs. Lopez was there too, her hair tied back, chewing on a piece of gum. Tommy's mom sat in the back, flipping through a magazine, and Lily's dad was next to her, tapping his foot like he wanted to leave already. Kids didn't usually come, but a few were there, sitting with their parents and looking bored. And up front? Ted and Carl. They stood by the stage, their arms crossed, their vests glowing bright orange under the lights. Ted's big belly stuck out, and Carl's squinty eyes darted around. They were puffing out their chests, acting all tough, like they owned the place. They didn't even notice Jake slip in and sit down near the middle. The meeting started slow, like always. Mrs. Carter, the real HOA president, stood up front. She was a nice lady with gray hair and glasses, always smiling and asking how everyone was. She didn't wear a vest or boss people around, she just wanted the neighborhood to be happy. Okay, folks, she said, her voice soft but clear. Let's talk about the picnic first. Who's bringing the lemonade this year? Some grown UPS raised their hands, and they chatted about drinks and cookies and stuff. Jake sat quiet, his laptop on his lap, waiting. He didn't care about lemonade. He had something way bigger to share. They talked for a while about the picnic, then about fixing a crack in the sidewalk, then about putting up new signs by the park. Ted and Carl kept interrupting, of course. We need stricter rules. Ted boomed, waving his hand. People park their cars all wrong. Carl nodded fast. Yeah, and the kids are too loud lately. A few people groaned, but nobody argued. They were used to Ted and Carl acting like that. Jake just sat there, his fingers tapping on his laptop, his smile growing a tiny bit bigger every time they talked. He knew something they didn't. He had a surprise up his sleeve. Finally, Mrs. Carter clapped her hands. All right, that's enough about signs, she said. Now it's time for new business. Does anyone have something to share? The room went quiet. Usually, nobody said much. Maybe someone would complain about a noisy dog or ask for a new bench. But this time, Jake's hand shot up. Fast, like a rocket. Me, he said, his voice bright and sweet. Can I show something? Everyone turned to look at him. Mrs. Carter blinked, surprised. Jake Miller, she said. Sure, honey. Come on up. The grown UPS nodded, smiling a little. They figured he'd show something cute like a drawing he made in school or a picture of his bike. Kids didn't usually talk at meetings, so they thought it'd be fun. Ted and Carl didn't even look worried. Ted leaned against the wall, smirking, and Carl picked at his nails. They were too busy puffing out their chests, acting big and important. They had no idea what was coming. Jake stood up, his sneakers squeaking on the floor. He held his laptop tight and walked to the front. His heart was thumping, but he didn't let it show. He kept that big smile on his face, like everything was normal. There was a projector on a table by the stage, a little machine that could show stuff on a big screen. Mrs. Carter helped him plug in his laptop. What's this about, Jake? She asked, curious. Jake just grinned. You'll see, he said. He clicked a few buttons, his fingers fast and sure, and the projector whirred to life. A blank white square lit up on the wall behind him. Everyone leaned forward a little, wondering what was next. Here we go, Jake said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. He hit play, and the video started. The room went silent, so silent you could hear Sparky panting in Mr. Jenkins' lap. Up on the screen, there it was, the dashcam footage. Clear as day, even though it was night when it happened. The picture was a little green from the night vision, but you could see everything. Ted and Carl, sneaking up to Jake's driveway in the dark. Their orange vests glowed like Halloween pumpkins, and their faces were right there, no mistake. Jake watched the crowd as the video played. He saw their eyes get big, their mouths drop open. On the screen, Carl pulled out his pocket knife, the one with the red handle. Slash, slash, slash. Went the knife, cutting through Jake's bike tires. Air hissed out, loud and sharp, and the tires flopped flat. Ted giggled, his big belly shaking. "Take that, kid," he whispered, his voice sneaky but clear. Carl laughed too, that croaky frog sound, and said, "Yeah, he's done now." They high-fived, grinning like they'd won a game, then strutted off into the dark. The crowd gasped all at once, like a big whoosh of air. "What?" Mrs. Lopez said, her gum falling out of her mouth. Mr. Jenkins sat up straight, his eyes wide. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. Tommy's mom dropped her magazine, and Lily's dad stopped tapping his foot. Everyone stared at the screen, then at Ted and Carl. The video looped back to the start slash, 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 and the gasps turned into whispers. "That's them," someone said. "They did that," said another. Jake turned to look at Ted and Carl. Oh, their faces. Ted's red cheeks went even redder, like a tomato about to burst. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish out of water. Carl ducked behind Ted, holding up his clipboard like a shield. His squinty eyes were huge now, darting around, looking for a way out. They weren't puffing out their chests anymore. Nope. They looked small, scared, caught. "That's not us," Ted yelled, his voice loud but shaky. He waved his arms, his vest flapping. "That's fake. That's not real." Carl nodded fast, peeking out from behind the clipboard. Yeah, it's a trick," he croaked. "But nobody bought it?" "Not for a second." "Those orange vests on the screen? They matched the ones Ted and Carl wore right now." Ted's big belly, Carl's squinty eyes, it was them, clear as sunshine. The crowd started talking louder, pointing at them, shaking their heads. Jake crossed his arms and stepped forward. He looked right at Ted and Carl, his green eyes sparkling. "You thought you could mess with me and get away with it," he said, his voice strong and steady. "Guess what? My dashcam says nope." He pointed at the screen, where the video was still playing slash, 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 and smiled big. "You're caught," he said. "Everyone sees it now." The room exploded. Not with a boom, but with voices. Everyone talked at once, loud and fast. "They slashed his tires," Mrs. Lopez said, standing up. "That's awful." Mr. Jenkins shook his fist, Sparky barking in his lap. "Bullies, that's what they are." Tommy's mom yelled, "They've been bossing us around too long." Even the kids joined in, whispering to their parents, pointing at Ted and Carl. The noise bounced off the walls, filling the air with anger and shock. Ted tried to talk again. "It's not true," he shouted, but his voice cracked. Nobody listened. Carl dropped his clipboard, and it clattered on the floor. He looked like he wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Mrs. Carter banged her hand on the table. "Quiet, everyone," she said, and the room hushed a little. She turned to Ted and Carl, her glasses slipping down her nose. "Is this real?" she asked, pointing at the screen. "Did you do this?" Ted's face went from red to white. He stammered. Carl mumbled, "We didn't mean it," but it was too late. The video kept playing, showing their sneaky giggles, their knife, their vests. It was all there, and they couldn't hide. Mrs. Carter shook her head. "This is bad," she said. "Really bad." Jake stood tall, his arms still crossed. He felt big like a superhero in one of his games. He'd waited for this moment, planned it, counted down the minutes. And now it was here. Ted and Carl weren't laughing anymore. They weren't strutting or acting tough. They were caught, and everyone knew it. Jake's dashcam had done it, shown the truth, loud and clear. The whole neighborhood saw who they really were. And Jake? He'd made it happen. The community center was loud, like really, really loud. The video Jake showed was still playing on the big screen behind him //// and the neighbors couldn't believe their eyes. The room exploded with chatter, like popcorn popping all at once. Everyone started talking, shouting, pointing at Ted and Carl. Their voices bounced off the walls, filling the air with noise. Jake stood there, his arms crossed, his big smile shining like the sun. He'd caught them. He'd shown everyone the truth. And now, things were about to get good. Mrs. Lopez jumped up from her chair, her hands on her hips. "You bullies," she yelled at Ted and Carl. "Slashing a kid's tires? That's mean." Mr. Jenkins waved his fist, his little dog Sparky yapping beside him. "Phonies," he shouted. "You're no cops, you're just troublemakers." Tommy's mom stood up too, her magazine falling to the floor. "You've been bossing us around forever," she said, her voice sharp. "This is too much." Even the kids in the room joined in, whispering to their parents, tugging their sleeves, saying stuff like, "They're bad guys, and Jake got 'em." Ted and Carl didn't know what to do. Ted's face was red as a tomato, no, redder than that, like a fire truck. He waved his arms, trying to yell over the crowd. "It's not true," he hollered, but his voice sounded shaky, like he didn't even believe himself. Carl hid behind Ted, his squinty eyes wide and scared. He held up his clipboard like it could save him, but it just made him look silly. Nobody was listening to them. Nobody cared what they said. The video was right there, Ted giggling, Carl slashing, the tires going flat. It was real, and everyone saw it. Then Mrs. Carter, the real HOA president, stood up. She was a nice lady with gray hair and glasses, always wearing a sweater and a smile. She wasn't loud like Ted or sneaky like Carl. She was fair, and people liked her. She banged her hand on the table, not hard, just enough to make everyone hush. "Quiet, please," she said, and the room got still. All eyes turned to her. She pushed her glasses up her nose and looked at Ted and Carl. Her face wasn't smiling now, it was serious. "You two," she said, pointing at them, "are done." Her voice was strong, like a teacher telling you to sit down. "No more fake cop stuff. No more walking around in those vests, telling people what to do." And she paused, looking at Jake, then back at them. "You're paying for Jake's tires. All of them. You broke them, you fix them." She crossed her arms, waiting. The crowd cheered loud and happy, like at a ball game when someone hits a home run. "Yeah." Mrs. Lopez clapped. "Make 'em pay." Mr. Jenkins nodded, patting Sparky's head. "About time," he said. Kids giggled and clapped too, their little hands slapping together. Jake felt his chest puff up. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. Everyone was on his side now. He felt big, strong, like a superhero in one of his video games. Like he'd just saved the day. Ted and Carl didn't cheer. Nope. They looked like they wanted to disappear. Ted's arms dropped to his sides, his big belly sagging. But, he mumbled, but nobody cared. Carl's clipboard slipped out of his hands and hit the floor with a clack. He didn't even pick it up. "We didn't mean it," he croaked, his frog voice all quiet and sad. But it was too late. The video kept playing ///, and their excuses didn't matter. They'd been caught, fair and square. Mrs. Carter turned to Jake. "Good job, Jake," she said, her smile coming back. "You showed us what happened. That was smart." Jake grinned at her. "Thanks," he said, his voice a little shy but proud. The crowd cheered again, and Jake felt warm all over, like he'd just eaten a big bowl of his mom's soup. He'd done it. He'd stood up to the bullies, and now they were in trouble. Ted and Carl didn't stick around. They slunk out of the meeting, their heads down low. Ted's big shoulders were slumped, and Carl shuffled behind him, his squinty eyes on the floor. They mumbled stuff as they went. "It's not fair, we were just joking," but nobody listened. The door creaked as they pushed it open, and then they were gone, out into the night. The room buzzed with talk, but it wasn't scared or mad anymore. It was excited. Happy. Like a party had just started. Jake unplugged his laptop from the projector and hugged it to his chest. The meeting kept going, more talk about picnic stuff, but Jake didn't care. He sat back down, his sneakers kicking the floor, and listened to the neighbors. They were still buzzing about Ted and Carl. Can you believe it? Mrs. Lopez said to Mr. Jenkins. Slashing tires. Who does that? Mr. Jenkins shook his head. Bullies, that's who. Good thing Jake had that camera. Tommy's mom nodded. He's a brave kid, she said. Jake heard it all, and his smile got even bigger. The next day was sunny and bright. Jake was in his room, playing his car racing game, when the doorbell rang. Ding dong. He paused the game, his little car frozen mid-jump, and ran downstairs. His mom was at the door, holding a small envelope. Jake, she said, this is for you. She handed it to him, her eyebrows up like she was curious. Jake ripped it open fast. Inside was cash, a little stack of dollar bills. And a note. He unfolded it and read, for the tires. Ted and Carl. The writing was messy, like they didn't want to write it, but there it was. Jake's mom peeked over his shoulder. What's this about? She asked. Jake grinned and told her everything: the tires, the dashcam, the meeting. Her eyes got wide, then she laughed. Jake Miller, she said, ruffling his hair. You're sneaky. Why didn't you tell me? Jake shrugged. I wanted to fix it myself, he said. She hugged him tight. I'm proud of you, she whispered. Jake hugged her back, feeling all warm and happy. He took the cash to the garage and grabbed his bike. The patched tires were okay, but now he could get new ones, good ones that wouldn't wobble. He rode to the store later that day, the wind in his hair, and picked out 4 shiny black tires. The guy at the shop helped him put them on, and when Jake rode home, his bike felt fast again, like it could fly. The bell went ding ding. And he laughed out loud. Ted and Carl had paid for it, just like Mrs. Carter said. Justice was served, and it felt awesome. Things changed after that. Ted and Carl didn't strut around anymore. Jake saw them a few days later, walking down the street. No orange vests, no loud voices. They wore plain shirts and kept their heads down, like they didn't want anyone to notice them. Jake was on his porch, sipping juice, and waved. Hey, guys, he called, all friendly. They flinched, looked at him, then hurried away fast. No laughing, no whispering. Those dumb vests? Gone for good. They weren't fake cops anymore, just 2 quiet guys who'd learned their lesson. The neighbors treated Jake differently too. He wasn't just that kid with the bike now. He was Jake, the kid who stood up to the bullies. The next time he rode to the park, Tommy ran over and high-fived him. Dude. Tommy said, his skateboard under his arm. You're a legend. Everyone's talking about that video. Jake laughed. Thanks, he said, his cheeks a little pink. Lily was there too, reading under her tree. She looked up and smiled, really smiled, not her usual shy one. You're cool, Jake, she said. Jake grinned back. You too, he said. Even the grown ups were nicer. Mrs. Lopez gave him a big tomato from her garden. For the hero, she said, winking. Mr. Jenkins stopped him one day and said, you did good, kid. Sparky likes you too. Sparky barked and wagged his tiny tail. Jake petted him, feeling proud. Everywhere he went, people smiled at him, waved, said hi. It was like he'd turned into the coolest person around, all because he stayed calm, used his brain, and let the truth do the talking. A week later, Jake was in his backyard, lying on the grass. The sky was blue, and clouds floated by like fluffy sheep. His bike was parked nearby, its new tires shiny in the sun. He thought about everything: Ted and Carl sneaking around, the dashcam catching them, the meeting where he showed the video. It felt like a big adventure, like a game he'd won. He didn't yell or fight or cry. He just waited, planned, and showed the truth. And it worked. The bullies were gone, his bike was fixed, and the neighborhood was happy again. Okay, everyone, let's take a minute and think about Jake's story. It's done now. Ted and Carl got caught, Jake's bike is fixed, and the neighborhood is happy again. But there's more to it than just tires and a sneaky video. There's something big here, something cool, and I want to share it with you. So grab a snack, sit back, and let's talk about what this all means. It's going to make you smile, I promise. Here's the thing, sometimes, the people who seem small or quiet like Jake are the ones with the biggest power. Think about it. Jake wasn't loud. He didn't run around yelling or showing off. He wasn't the tallest kid or the fastest talker. He was just a regular boy with messy hair and a red bike. To Ted and Carl, he looked like someone they could push around. They saw him riding his bike, keeping to himself, and thought, oh, this kid's easy. We can scare him, mess with him, and he won't do anything. They thought he was weak because he didn't fight back right away. But guess what? They were so wrong. Jake had power, big power hiding inside him. It wasn't muscles or a loud voice. It was his brain. His smart ideas. His sneaky little dashcam. Ted and Carl didn't see him coming. They strutted around in their goofy vests, laughing and slashing his tires, thinking they'd won. But Jake? He stayed calm. He watched. He waited. And when the time was right, bam, he showed everyone the truth. That's real strength, right there. Not punching or shouting, but thinking and planning. Jake was like a secret superhero, and nobody knew it until he flew in and saved the day. So what about you? Yeah, you, reading this right now. Maybe you feel small sometimes. Maybe there's someone out there, a bully, a mean kid, or even a grumpy grown-up who tries to push you around. Maybe they laugh at you or tell you you're not good enough. Maybe they think you're quiet or weak, like Ted and Carl thought about Jake. But here's the secret, you're not small. Not really. You've got your own power inside you, just waiting to come out. It's like Jake's dashcam, maybe not a real camera, but something special that's all yours. Something that can catch the truth and turn things around. What's your dashcam? Let's think about that for a minute. Maybe it's your voice telling someone what's right or wrong. Like if a kid at school is being mean, you could say, hey, stop that, and make them think twice. Or maybe it's your ideas coming up with a smart plan to fix a problem. Like if your friends are fighting, you could figure out a game to make them laugh instead. Or maybe it's just you being you, staying kind and strong, even when things get tough. That's power too, you know. Being nice when others aren't. That's huge. Let me tell you a little story to show what I mean. Imagine a girl named Sarah. She's quiet, like Jake. She likes drawing pictures in her notebook, dogs, trees, stars, stuff like that. At school, there's this boy, Mike, who's loud and bossy. He picks on Sarah sometimes, saying her drawings are silly. Nobody cares about your dumb pictures, he says, laughing with his friends. Sarah doesn't yell back. She just keeps drawing. But one day, there's a contest at school. Best picture wins a prize. Sarah enters her drawing of a big, happy dog. Guess what? She wins. The teacher puts it up on the wall, and everyone says, wow, Sarah, that's so cool. Mike's jaw drops. He stops laughing after that. Sarah didn't fight him. She didn't cry. She used her quiet power, her drawings, and showed him up. See? Small doesn't mean weak. That's what Jake did too. Ted and Carl thought they were big shots, strutting around, slashing tires. But Jake's quiet power, his dashcam, his waiting, his smart move at the meeting beat them. They didn't expect it. They didn't think a kid like Jake could do anything. But he did. He turned the tables, flipped the game, made them look silly. And you can do that too, in your own way. You don't need a camera or a bike. You just need you. Let's imagine something else. Say you're at the park, and there's a kid who keeps taking the ball from everyone. He runs around, kicking it away, laughing like it's funny. You could get mad and yell, but maybe that's what he wants. Or you could be like Jake, watch, think, wait. Maybe you talk to the other kids and say, let's play something new. He can't steal that. So you all start a game of tag instead, and the ball kid gets left out, looking dumb. You didn't fight. You used your brain. That's your dashcam, your smart idea that fixes things. Or maybe it's not even a bully. Maybe it's something hard, like a test at school you're scared about. You could give up and say, I'm not smart enough. But that's not true. You've got power inside, like Jake's patience. You could study a little every day, ask for help, keep trying. Then, when you pass that test, it's like showing the world, see? I did it. That's turning things around, just like Jake did with Ted and Carl. Here's another fun idea, think about animals. A lion's big and loud, right? roaring all over the jungle, scaring everyone. Ted and Carl were like lions, or at least they thought they were. But what about a mouse? A mouse is tiny, quiet, sneaky. It doesn't roar, but it can still get what it wants, like sneaking cheese right under the cat's nose. Jake was a mouse in the story. Small, quiet, but super smart. And he got the cheese, well, the new tires, anyway. You can be a mouse too. You don't have to roar to win. So don't let anyone make you feel small. Not ever. If someone's mean, if they laugh at you, if they think you can't do anything, smile and remember Jake. He didn't let Ted and Carl push him down. He stood up, not with fists or shouts, but with his brain and his truth. You've got that too. Maybe it's your kindness, your ideas, your courage. It's there, waiting for you to use it. And when you do, oh boy, watch out. The bullies, the meanies, the tough guys, they won't know what hit them. Now, let's talk about Jake's story one more time, because it's so cool. He started out as just a kid with a bike, right? Riding around, having fun, not bothering anyone. Ted and Carl saw him and thought, easy target. They slashed his tires, giggled, strutted away. They thought that was it, game over. But Jake had his dash cam. He had his plan. He waited, waved at them, acted normal, then bam, dropped the truth at the meeting. The whole neighborhood cheered. Ted and Carl ran off, tails between their legs. Jake won, not because he was loud or big, but because he was smart and brave. That's the best kind of win. What did you think of that? I want to know. Did Jake's story make you laugh? Did it make you cheer? Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have done the same thing? If someone messed with your stuff, would you use a camera like Jake, or maybe something else? Tell me your ideas. I bet you've got some awesome ones, because you're awesome too. Oh, and if you liked this story, if it made you smile or feel big, hit that like button. It's a little way to say, hey, I love this. And stick around, because there's more fun stuff coming. I'll see you next time. But before I go, let's dream a little. Picture yourself as Jake. Maybe not with a bike or a dash cam, but in your own life. What's your Ted and Carl? What's the thing that's bugging you, trying to push you down? Maybe it's a kid at school, a tricky homework problem, or even a fear, like talking in front of people. Now picture your power, your own dash cam. What's it look like? Is it your smile? Your words? Your hard work? Whatever it is, it's yours. And when you use it, when you stay calm, think smart, and show the truth, you'll win, just like Jake. Think about that tomorrow. When you wake up, when you go to school or play outside, remember, you're not small. You're big inside, where it counts. You've got something special, something strong. Ted and Carl didn't see Jake coming, and nobody will see you coming either. You're a secret superhero, ready to shine. So go out there, be you, and don't let anyone stop you. Okay. Promise me that. You're awesome, and the world needs you to be awesome. See you soon. So, we were talking about you being a secret superhero, right? Just like Jake. You've got that power inside you, ready to shine, and nobody can take it away. Let's keep dreaming about that, because it's too cool to stop now. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. The sun's out, your room's all cozy, and you stretch your arms big. You're not just a kid getting ready for school or play, you're someone with a secret strength. Maybe you don't even know what it is yet, but it's there, waiting for the perfect moment, like Jake's dashcam waited for Ted and Carl. Let's make it fun. Pretend you're walking to school, your backpack bouncing on your shoulders. You've got your favorite shirt on, maybe it's got a rocket or a dog or a big smiley face. You feel good, but then something happens. There's this kid, let's call him Ben, who's always loud and pushy. He's by the swings, telling everyone they can't play unless they give him their snacks. Gimme your cookies, or no swinging, he says, crossing his arms like he's the boss. The other kids look sad, holding their lunch bags tight. What do? You could walk away, sure. Or you could yell at Ben and start a fight. But what if you're like Jake? What if you use your quiet power instead? You think for a second, then smile. You walk over to the other kids and say, hey, let's play tag over there. Ben can keep the swings, he'll get bored. The kids grin, drop their snacks in their bags, and run off with you. Ben's left standing there, all alone, looking silly. You didn't shout. You didn't cry. You used your brain just like Jake did and turned things around. That's your dashcam moment right there. Or maybe it's not at school. Maybe it's at home. Say your little brother keeps taking your toys like that cool car you love to race around. He grabs it, runs off, and laughs like it's a game. You could get mad and snatch it back, but what if you try something else? You sit down, grab some paper, and draw a picture of two cars racing. You show it to him and say, "Let's play together. You race yours, I'll race mine." He stops laughing, looks at the picture, and nods. Now you're playing, not fighting. That's your power turning a mess into fun. Small, sneaky, smart. Let's try another one, because this is too much fun to stop. Picture you're at a birthday party. There's cake, balloons, music, everything's great. But then this girl, Mia, starts bossing everyone around. "You can't have cake yet," she says, standing by the table like a guard. "I'm in charge." The other kids frown, hungry for that chocolate frosting. You could argue, but you're smarter than that. You grab a balloon, blow it up big, and start a game. "Who can bounce this the longest?" you shout. Everyone runs over, laughing, forgetting Mia. She's left by the cake, looking lost. You didn't push her. You didn't yell. You used your quiet strength, your dashcam, and made things better. See what I mean? You don't have to be loud or big to win. Jake wasn't. He was just a kid with a bike and a camera, but he beat Ted and Carl because he stayed calm and used what he had. You've got stuff too. Maybe it's a smile, a joke, a good idea. It's like a little spark inside you, waiting to light up. And when it does, oh boy, it's bright. Nobody can stop that light, not bullies, not meanies, not even a bad day. Let's think about Jake again, because his story is so awesome. He didn't wake up that Saturday thinking, "I'm gonna be a hero." Nope. He was just riding his bike, having fun, when Ted and Carl messed with him. They slashed his tires, laughed, and walked away. If Jake was loud or mad, he might have run out and yelled at them right then. But he didn't. He peeked out his window, saw them, and went, He grabbed his dashcam the next day, watched the video, and grinned. He waited, waved at them, acted normal, all while holding that secret. Then, at the meeting, bam, he showed it. Ted and Carl's jaws dropped, the crowd cheered, and Jake won. That's quiet power. That's you, too. What's your quiet power? Maybe you're good at listening. Like if your friend's sad, you sit with them and let them talk. That's bigger than shouting. Or maybe you're good at making stuff like drawing, building, singing. You could use that to cheer someone up or show them you're strong. Or maybe you're just brave, like Jake, waiting for the right time to stand up. Whatever it is, it's yours. It's special. And it can change everything. Let's dream bigger. Imagine you're on a team like soccer or dodgeball. There's this kid who's always bragging, saying, "I'm the best." You're all slow. He hogs the ball, doesn't pass, acts like a star. The team's mad, but nobody says anything. You could quit, but you don't. You watch him, see he's not so great at passing, then whisper to your friends, "Let's run fast and score without him." You do it, zip, zap, goal. The coach claps, the bragger's quiet, and your team wins. You didn't fight. You used your sneaky smarts. That's your dashcam, catching the truth and turning the game around. Or what about this? You're at the library, picking a book. There's a kid who keeps cutting in line, pushing everyone back. "I'm first," he says, loud and rude. You could push too, but you're like Jake. You wait, then say to the others, "Let's pick books from the back shelf he won't see." You all sneak off, grab the best stories, and he's stuck with boring ones. Quiet win, big smile. That's you, small but mighty. Don't ever forget that. Even on tough days, when it's rainy, when homework's hard, when someone's mean, you've got power. Jake had tough days too. His tires got slashed. But he didn't give up. He fixed them, waited, and won. You can fix stuff too. Maybe not tires, but feelings, fights, fears. You've got that spark, that secret strength. And when you use it, you shine brighter than the sun. So here's my challenge, tomorrow, try it. Be a little like Jake. If something's wrong, don't just get mad. Think. Watch. Find your dashcam your way to fix it. Maybe you help someone, maybe you make a plan, maybe you just smile and keep going. Whatever you do, you'll feel big inside. And that's the best feeling, like you're flying a rocket to the moon. What did you think of Jake's story? I really want to know. Drop a comment below, tell me if it made you laugh, if it made you cheer, if it made you feel strong. Would you have done the same thing? Used a camera, or something else? I bet you've got cool ideas, share them. And if you like this, hit that like button. It's a tiny high five to say, this was fun. Stick around, 2 more stories are coming, and I can't wait to see you again. You're awesome, okay? Never let anyone make you feel small. You've got your own dashcam, your own power inside you. Use it, shine it, show the world. Ted and Carl didn't see Jake coming, and nobody will see you coming either. Go be amazing. See you next time. His mom called him in for dinner, spaghetti, his favorite. As he ran inside, he felt light, like he could jump to the moon. Ted and Carl thought they could mess with him, but they were wrong. Jake was small, sure, but he was smart. And now everyone knew it. Justice was served, and it tasted better than any spaghetti ever could. As Jake drifted off to sleep, one last thought floated through his head: you guys are in big trouble. The tension was thick, like the air before a storm. Ted and Carl had started this fight, but Jake was going to finish it. And when he did, the whole neighborhood would see who the real boss was. So, here's my question for you, reader: what would you do if someone tried to mess with you and thought they could sneak away? Would you let it go? Or would you find a way to show them they picked the wrong kid to mess with? Stick around, because Jake's about to show us what he does. And trust me, it's going to be awesome.